Hello, my name is Lionel. I'm the Medicines Development Lead for Pediatric HIV at ViiV Healthcare. Now, I trained and practiced as an adult infectious disease physician, but I have a passion for pediatric drug development. And this stems from the fact that my youngest daughter was born prematurely and spent some time on the neonatal intensive care unit. When I used to visit her on the ward, I used to look at a drug chart. What I noticed was that there were several drugs on the chart, especially antibiotics, which were quite old, and were not drugs I particularly prescribed to my adult patients anymore. This made me realise that we, as a community, need to work hard to ensure that our youngest and most vulnerable patients population have access to the best drugs. I'm going to talk to you today about pediatric HIV, the challenges and opportunities. This is my conflict of interest statement. The HIV epidemic in children and adolescents is neglected. There are still 1.7 million children living with HIV worldwide, with the vast majority in sub-Saharan Africa. There are around 160,000 new infections in children under the age of 5, and a similar number amongst adolescents each year. These new infections are largely preventable. About half of children living with HIV are accessing treatment, and this compares with 3/4 of adults. Why this statistic is important is the fact that infants born with HIV, if they're not receiving treatment, half of them will die by the age of 2 years. Quite a stark statistic. If you focus on the bottom half of this slide, this provides some of the explanation why fewer children are accessing treatment compared to adults. Moving to the far right-hand side of the boxes, you can see that adults, there are over 20 single ARV drugs approved and over 20 fixed-dose combination drugs approved for adults. While this number decreases as you move down the age groups to infants and young children, if you focus on the neonates box in the far left-hand corner, you can see that there are only 6 single ARV drugs approved for neonates and no fixed-dose combinations. That's 6 drugs compared to over 20 for adults. We have to do better. The World Health Organization meets every 2 to 3 years, and the PEDO group sets priorities for pediatric ARV development. They last met in September to October last year, and this is the PEDO 5 list. This list of priorities is both for treatment and also prevention. However, in spite of prioritization by the WHO, there still remain a number of challenges. Focus on the left half of the slide, there are challenges with clinical development in terms of, for example, clinical study design and conduct. There's also challenges in terms of developing sometimes complex child-friendly formulations. Children below a certain age are unable to swallow adult-sized tablets, so they need either smaller tablets or dispersible tablets or even liquids. Drug palatability is an issue amongst children. For example, if you're an adult and you were given a bitter medicine, I'm sure you'd probably just swallow it, whereas a child, not knowing anything better, would probably spit it out. So adherence is a big issue amongst all age groups, and adherence is where you take the medicine as prescribed by your doctor. Adherence is a particular issue, I guess, amongst children and adolescents, and maybe due to their caregivers. For example, when our youngest daughter was discharged from the neonatal intensive care unit, we were told to give her a daily solution of iron. Now, we had to give this oral solution of iron every day through an injection through her mouth. So we'd draw up the syringe from the solution and try and squirt it into her mouth. And it was really, really challenging. And we did not manage to do that every day. We move on to access to supply. The epidemic is much smaller in children than it is in adults. And this means that the volumes of drug given or needed is far smaller in adults, which puts up the price. The market is also unpredictable, and there's a fragmented market because multiple doses and formulations, as I mentioned earlier, are needed depending on the age group. So how do we overcome these challenges? I think through partnerships and innovation. And I'm going to give examples in the next slides about 3 different areas. How do you increase access to ARVs in low and middle income countries? So dolutegravir is an ARV that was approved by the FDA for adults and adolescents in 2013 and children in 2016. 2 years later, WHO were recommending dolutegravir as first-line treatment in guidelines for these different populations. At the same time, ViiV Healthcare was developing a pediatric dispersible dolutegravir tablet. There was no manufacturing by generic companies at this time. This led to a unique partnership between the Clinton Health Access Initiative, or CHI, and ViiV to expedite generic development and registration of dolutegravir pediatrics. So CHI were able to provide some incentives to generic manufacturers, and also then managed to receive a commitment from 2 generic manufacturers to accelerate the development of a dispersible dolutegravir tablet. At the same time, ViiV partnered with the Penta network and the Impact network, which are both pediatric clinical trials network, to expedite generation of evidence and data to support registration of the drug. And that was the Odyssey and the P1093 studies. This led to FDA approval in June of 2020 and EMA approval in January 2021 of our pediatric dispersible tablet. Of note, one of the generic manufacturers had provisional registration and approval by the end of 2020, and the other one had it in 2021, which is quite remarkable. If you focus on the text in red, 56 countries as of July 2022 had procured the 10 mg dispersible tablet formulation dolutegravir. So this whole partnership sped up the access to these countries, many of them low middle income countries, to a affordable and cheap version of dolutegravir for the children. So moving on to expediting clinical development of new ARVs. And I'm going to concentrate on long-acting ARVs and how you can extrapolate data from adults. Now, long-acting ARVs are under discussion in adult HIV as well as pediatric HIV, because they have potentially a number of advantages. So they may address some challenges with ARV administration in children and adolescents. You focus on the orange box in the top corner. I've listed some of the challenges here. So, for example, as we mentioned, children may need to take lots of different pills for their HIV. And I spoke to a Ugandan doctor recently, and he was telling me about a 7-year-old girl who was taking 11.5 tablets a day to treat her HIV. That's a lot of tablets. So imagine if she could take a tablet perhaps once every week, or indeed have injections every month or every other month, how much her quality of life would improve, and actually also her adherence to treatment. Other issues are around toxicity and tolerability, and also food and fluid requirements with specific tablets. And the other thing to focus on is also this the fear of stigma or disclosure concerns. So this may be more so amongst teenagers. For example, teenager living a very active life, they're having to take daily tablets. There's a risk that their friends or their family may find out about their HIV. However, if they were able to take a long-acting treatment, for example, as I said, weekly or injections less frequently, this would mean they could potentially get on with their lives and not fear so much disclosing or accidentally disclosing their HIV status. There are a number of long-acting therapies undergoing clinical development, which I've listed on the right. There's also an approved therapy for adolescents, which is long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine for treatment. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. The cabotegravir and rilpivirine long-acting were assessed in the ATLAS FLARE and ATLAS 2M studies in adults and were shown to be non-inferior to the standard of care. Shortly afterwards, the ViiV Healthcare started a study in adolescents called the MOCA or Impact 2017 study. And at the interim analysis at week 16, what we're able to demonstrate, and you focus on the graphs in the middle, is actually the drug concentrations in adolescents was very similar to that seen in adults. So if you look at the top graph, that's in green, you can see the CAB concentrations in the adolescents in MOCA, and it's very similar to the grey solid and dotted lines, which are the concentrations of cabotegravir in the adults in the 2 phase 3 studies. Similarly, if you look at the bottom graph, you can see that the red line, which represents rilpivirine concentrations, are almost overlap the grey ones of the FLARE and ATLAS adults. So using this data, because we're extrapolating from adults, because we could say that because the concentrations of the drugs were similar to that seen in adults, the efficacy would be the same. There was no new safety signals in the study at the interim analysis. And so we use this data to support registration in the US for an adolescent indication in March of this year. This was not so long after approval in adults. But it's a lot quicker than it would have been if we'd waited for the completion of the MOCA study, which is still ongoing now. Of note, the FDA now recommends the inclusion of adolescents in actual phase 3 adult studies to expedite approval of drugs for adolescents. And this is something that we are considering for our future studies. So moving on now to prevention of new infections, I'm going to talk about new infections in adults, adolescents, and also prevention of mother-to-child transmission. So there are various methods available to prevent sexual transmission of HIV in adults and also adolescents, which are listed here. I'm going to focus on pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is taking tablets or injectable to prevent you getting sexual transmission of HIV. So you focus on the left. You take a daily tablet combination. This has good efficacy at preventing HIV infection. So you can see in the bars that actually if you take the pills more than 9 out of 10 times, then you have good efficacy. However, if you take the pill less than 90% of the time, then actually the efficacy is less good. And as we said earlier, actually adherence may be an issue amongst adolescents. Then moving on to long-acting now, cabotegravir long-acting was assessed for prevention in the HPTN 083 and 084 studies in adults. And in these studies, CAB long-acting was shown to be superior to the oral daily tablets. And additionally, it was found to be well tolerated, and the safety profile was similar between all the study arms. So using this data and the MOCA data that we talked about earlier, we're able to get approval for adolescents and adults at the same time for CAB long-acting for prevention of HIV infection. So moving on to postnatal prophylaxis. So in front of you, you can see the current recommendations for postnatal prophylaxis. And what's striking, it's quite complex, but what's also striking is that we're using quite old drugs. So zidovudine was the first ever antiretroviral drug approved for adults in 1987, and nevirapine was approved in 1996. So it's an effective regimen, but it is quite old, and there are certain issues regarding the use of these drugs. So fast forward to 2022, and the Paleo HIV 5 list, which I mentioned earlier, did have a focus on prevention and the possibility of using long-acting in the future for postnatal prophylaxis. However, there are multiple challenges in developing ARVs for neonates, and this would be the same whether we're using long-acting or short-acting drugs. So there is a rapid weight gain in neonates, and they may triple their weight from birth up to the age of 1. This means you need to change the dose of their drug quite frequently. If you focus on the bottom half of the slide, the other challenge is actually around maturation. So the metabolic pathways and also the renal system are quite immature in neonates. And this means that actually they need a lower dose in milligrams per kilograms compared to adults to achieve the same drug concentrations. This is in contrast to infants and young children who have higher clearance and thus require a higher dose than adults. The original studies which enabled zidovudine to make it into guidelines for the use of postnatal prophylaxis were very large, actually, and they were randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials and required almost 300 to 400 mother-to-child pairs. Now, we won't be able to replicate studies like that anymore because the epidemic is a very different place from 1994. And there's far fewer infections overall. So there are a number of innovative methods based on pharmacology, which may be the way forward in terms of studying new drugs and long-acting therapies for HIV prevention in neonates. I've listed some of these neonatal PK methodology on the left. However, I think to ensure that we are able to undertake these studies, we need global partnerships. These studies can be quite challenging to undertake. So there need to be global partnerships amongst regulatory authorities and funding organisations who don't often fund studies in neonates, international organisations to ensure there is access to the drugs if we do find drugs which are suitable, and the global research networks and pharmaceutical companies must work together to undertake these PK studies. So global partnerships are required to move forward PK studies for neonates. So in conclusion for the talk, I think the take-home message is that global partnerships are essential to close the gap between adults and children living with HIV. I want you as the audience to continue to advocate for paediatric drug development, and this will enable us to ensure that no one living with HIV, and that includes children, is left behind. Thank you very much for listening.